There are people who do not enter your life to love you, but to measure themselves against you. They do not seek connection, but control, and they often wear charm the way others wear a mask. Yet beneath all their confidence and noise lies a truth they spend their lives avoiding, because every illusion, no matter how carefully built, has a weakness that time and truth will eventually reveal. A narcissist depends on attention the way a flame depends on oxygen. Remove it, and what once seemed powerful begins to flicker, shrink, and reveal its true size. You may have seen it before, though you did not have the words for it at the time. The way they lean in when emotions rise, how their energy sharpens when your voice trembles, how they seem to grow taller in moments when you feel small. It is not strength that fuels them, it is reaction. It is the unseen exchange where your attention becomes their validation, your confusion becomes their control, and your emotional response becomes the stage on which they perform. But there is something they do not expect, something they are rarely prepared to face. It is not confrontation, not loud defiance, not a battle of words. It is your stillness. It is your decision to no longer participate in the cycle that feeds them. When you begin to respond without emotion, when your voice carries calm instead of chaos, when your presence no longer offers the energy they are used to consuming, something shifts. Not always loudly, not always immediately, but undeniably. The performance loses its rhythm. The script begins to fail. You must understand, this is not about becoming cold or distant from the world. It is about becoming intentional with where your energy flows. There is a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from strength. One shrinks you, but the other protects you. One keeps you trapped, but the other sets you free. And in that freedom, you begin to see clearly what was once hidden behind emotional noise. They may try harder at first. They may provoke, press, and push in ways that feel sharper than before, because a fire deprived of oxygen will reach desperately for air. But desperation is not power, it is exposure. It reveals the very weakness they work so carefully to conceal. And if you remain steady, if you refuse to be pulled back into the storm, you will witness something remarkable. Their influence begins to fade, not because they have changed, but because you have. This is where your power lives, not in overpowering them, but in outgrowing the need to respond to them. You are not required to match their volume, to explain your worth, or to defend your peace. There is a quiet authority in choosing not to engage, in recognizing that your attention is valuable, and not everyone deserves access to it. And when you truly understand this, not just in thought, but in practice, you take back something they once borrowed from you without permission. Your energy becomes your own again. Your emotions are no longer tools in someone else's hands, and the illusion they once held so tightly begins to dissolve, not with force, but with absence. Their confidence often arrives before them, loud and polished, like a story already rehearsed. It shines in their words, in the way they carry themselves, in the certainty they project, as if doubt has never touched their doorstep. But confidence that must always be seen, always be acknowledged, always be proven, is not the kind that rests easy within the soul. It is constructed, piece by piece, to be witnessed rather than felt. And beneath that careful construction, there is often something far more fragile than they would ever allow the world to see, for what they fear most is not failure in the way others understand it. It is something quieter, something more personal. It is the fear of being ordinary, of blending into a world that does not stop to applaud them, of existing without the constant reassurance that they are exceptional. This fear does not shout. It whispers in the background of their every action. It pushes them to seek admiration not as a joy, but as a necessity. And so, what appears as confidence is often a shield, designed not to express strength, but to protect a very specific vulnerability. You may notice how easily their confidence cracks when it is not reinforced. A simple lack of attention, a moment where they are not the center, a situation they cannot control, these become disruptions they struggle to navigate. Because when the applause fades, even briefly, they are left alone with the very feeling they have been trying to outrun. And in that silence, the mask feels heavier. This is why they often surround themselves with noise, with validation, with people who reflect back the image they wish to maintain. It is not connection they are seeking, but confirmation, not understanding, but agreement. And when that reflection is challenged or withdrawn, their response can shift quickly, sometimes unexpectedly, because it touches the place they work hardest to hide. But there is something important to understand here, something that changes the way you see it all. Their behavior is not a measure of your worth. It is a reflection of their own unresolved struggle. The way they elevate themselves or diminish others is not rooted in truth, but in the need to maintain the image they depend on. And once you see that clearly, without anger, without resentment, it begins to lose its hold on you. You are not here to reinforce someone else's illusion, nor to shrink yourself so another can feel larger. You are allowed to exist fully without participating in the unspoken demands of their insecurity. And when you stand in that understanding, steady and unshaken, something shifts, not in them perhaps, but in you. You begin to recognize that true confidence does not need to announce itself. It does not depend on constant validation or external proof. And in that recognition, you reclaim your perspective. You no longer see their confidence as something to admire or fear, but as something to understand, not with judgment, but with clarity. Because once the mask is seen for what it is, it no longer has the same power to convince you. And what once felt overwhelming begins to look, in a quiet and undeniable way, human. There is a certain kind of person they find difficult to understand, and even more difficult to control. The one who does not rise when they provoke, who does not bend when they pressure, who does not offer emotion as an easy doorway into their world. It unsettles them, this quiet resistance, because it does not follow the patterns they have come to rely on. They are used to reactions that come quickly. Anger they can twist, pain they can use, confusion they can deepen. But when they are met with calm, something in their approach begins to lose its precision. You see, their strength has never truly been in what they say, but in what they can make others feel. It is in the subtle push that turns a conversation into a conflict, in the carefully chosen words that invite you to defend yourself, to explain, to prove. And once you step into that space, the ground shifts in their favor. But when you choose not to enter, when you remain steady and unmoved, their usual tools begin to feel ineffective, almost misplaced. This does not mean they will stop. In fact, there are moments when they may try harder, pressing in ways that feel sharper, more deliberate, as if searching for a response they can finally grasp. They may test your patience, question your silence, even attempt to draw you out with stronger emotion. But there is a quiet power in not giving what is being demanded. It is not avoidance, it is awareness. It is the understanding that not every invitation deserves acceptance. And in that understanding, something begins to shift. Their words may continue, but without the reaction they seek, those words begin to lose weight. Their provocations fall into a kind of emptiness, where they no longer echo back with the energy they depend on. It is like watching a performance where the audience has quietly left. Everything is still happening, but the purpose has faded. This kind of composure is not always easy. It asks you to step beyond instinct, to pause where you might once have reacted, to choose clarity over impulse. It requires a certain grounding within yourself, a recognition that your peace is not something to be negotiated in moments of tension. And as you practice this, as you begin to respond with intention rather than emotion, you may notice a change not only in them, but within yourself. Because the truth is, when you are no longer pulled by every attempt to provoke, you begin to feel a different kind of strength, one that is not loud or forceful, but steady and self-assured. You are no longer moving in response to their rhythm. You are standing in your own. And that makes all the difference. What they struggle with most is not confrontation, but the absence of control. They do not know how to navigate someone who cannot be easily stirred, someone who does not offer their emotions as leverage. And in that space, where their usual methods fall short, their limitations quietly reveal themselves. And so, without raising your voice, without engaging in the battles they expect, you create a distance they cannot easily cross, not by force, but by choice, not by resistance, but by presence. And in that presence, calm and unwavering, you step out of their reach in a way they cannot quite understand, but cannot easily undo. There is a quiet strategy at work in the way they move through conversations, a subtle weaving of words that leaves you second-guessing what you heard and questioning what you felt. It is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it comes as contradiction, sometimes as deflection, sometimes as a shifting of blame, so smooth you almost miss the moment it happens. And before long, you find yourself explaining things you were once certain about, defending truths that never needed defense. This is not by accident. Their control often lives in that space where clarity begins to blur. Confusion is a powerful tool because it slows you down while it gives them room to lead. When you are unsure, you look outward for answers. When your thoughts feel tangled, you become more open to someone else's version of events. And in that opening, they step forward, not always with truth, but with certainty. And certainty, even when misplaced, can feel convincing to a mind that has been pulled into doubt. But there is something stronger than confusion, something that does not require force or argument. It is clarity, not the kind that needs to be proven in every moment, but the kind that is quietly anchored within you. It is the ability to pause and recognize what is real, even when someone tries to reshape it. It is trusting your own understanding without needing constant validation from the outside. Clarity does not rush. It does not chase every accusation or respond to every twist in the conversation. Instead, it observes. It listens not only to what is being said, but to what is being avoided. And in that awareness, patterns begin to reveal themselves. You start to notice how the story changes, how accountability is redirected, how the focus shifts away from what truly matters. And once you see it clearly, it becomes much harder to be pulled back into it. They may resist this. They may attempt to reintroduce doubt, to question your perception, to make you feel as though you are misunderstanding or overreacting. But clarity, when it is grounded, does not need to argue to exist. It simply remains. It holds its place even when challenged, even when pressured to give way. This is where their influence begins to weaken. Because without confusion, their words lose the same effect. Without your uncertainty, their control has less room to grow. What once felt overwhelming begins to look more transparent, more predictable, more limited than it first appeared. And as you hold on to that clarity, something within you settles. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond, to defend, to untangle every thread they present. You begin to choose your engagement with intention, rather than being pulled into it without thought. And in that choice, your energy remains your own. There is a quiet strength in seeing things as they are, without distortion, without unnecessary doubt. It does not make you rigid, it makes you steady. And that steadiness becomes a boundary they cannot easily cross, because when clarity takes root, confusion no longer has the same place to grow. And in that space where your understanding is no longer easily shaken, their influence begins to fade, not with resistance, but with recognition. There is something profoundly unsettling to a person who is used to crossing lines when they finally encounter one that does not move. Not a boundary built from anger, not one drawn in the heat of frustration, but one placed with quiet certainty. clear, steady, and unchanged by pressure. It is not the presence of the boundary alone that challenges them, but the way it is held, calmly, firmly, without the need to justify it again and again. You see, they are often prepared for resistance that is emotional. They know how to respond to raised voices, to tears, to reactions that come with intensity. Those moments give them something to work with, something to shape and redirect. But a boundary that is delivered without emotional charge, one that does not invite debate or negotiation, leaves very little room for their usual approach. It stands there, not as a challenge to be fought, but as a truth to be acknowledged. Consistency is what gives that boundary its strength. Anyone can set a limit once, in a moment of clarity, but what follows is where the real test begins, because they may return to it, not always directly, but in subtle ways, pushing gently at first, then more firmly, watching for any sign that it might bend. They may frame it as misunderstanding, as flexibility, even as care. But beneath it all is a simple question. Will this line hold, or will it shift? And when it does not shift, when it remains exactly where it was placed, something begins to change. Not always in their behavior immediately, but in the dynamic itself. The space they once moved through freely becomes more defined. The access they once assumed becomes limited, and without the ability to gradually wear the boundary down, their influence begins to narrow. This does not require harshness. In fact, it often works best without it. There is a difference between building a wall and setting a boundary. A wall shuts everything out, often born from hurt or fear. A boundary, on the other hand, is an act of self-respect. It says quietly but clearly, "This is where I stand." It does not seek to control the other person. It simply defines what you will and will not allow into your space. They may not understand this at first. They may interpret calmness as weakness, firmness as temporary, consistency as something that can eventually be undone. But over time, as the pattern repeats and the boundary remains unchanged, the message becomes harder to ignore. It is not spoken loudly, but it is communicated through action, through presence, through the quiet refusal to move away from what has been decided. And in that refusal, there is strength, not the kind that needs recognition, but the kind that creates stability. You are no longer responding to each moment as it comes. You are standing within something you have already chosen, and that choice becomes a foundation, one that does not shake easily under pressure. What they struggle with most is not the existence of limits, but the absence of openings within them. They look for exceptions, for moments of doubt, for signs that the boundary might be softened or reconsidered. But when those openings are not there, when the line remains clear and steady, their usual ways of navigating begin to lose their effectiveness. And so, without raising your voice, without engaging in constant explanation, you create a space that is defined by your own clarity. A space where respect is not requested, but required. And in that space, something shifts. Not because you forced it, but because you held it. There is a kind of truth that does not need to be sharpened by anger to be powerful. It does not arrive loudly or forcefully, nor does it seek to wound in order to be heard. It stands on its own, steady and unshaken, carrying a clarity that speaks deeper than any raised voice ever could. And for someone who has grown accustomed to twisting words, redirecting blame, or hiding behind carefully crafted narratives, this kind of truth can feel deeply unsettling. They are prepared for conflict. They know how to respond to accusations fueled by emotion, how to deflect when the conversation becomes heated, how to turn intensity into distraction. Anger, in many ways, gives them something to work with. It shifts the focus away from what is being said and places it onto how it is being said. And in that shift, the truth itself can become lost, buried beneath reaction and noise. But when truth is spoken without anger, it leaves no such opening. It does not invite deflection in the same way, because it does not come wrapped in chaos. It is clear, direct, and grounded. It does not chase agreement, nor does it depend on validation. It simply states what is real, and then it stands there, unchanged, regardless of how it is received. This is where something begins to shift. Without the presence of anger, there is less to redirect, less to manipulate, less to turn against you. The usual strategies begin to lose their footing because they rely so heavily on emotional movement. And when that movement is no longer there, when the truth is delivered with calm certainty, it becomes much harder to distort. You may notice a pause in those moments, however brief, a hesitation, a searching for a response that does not come as easily as before. Because truth, when it is steady, has a way of revealing what has been hidden, not by force, but by contrast. It stands beside distortion and makes it visible. It does not need to argue against it. Its presence alone begins to separate what is real from what is not. This does not mean the truth will always be accepted. There may still be denial, dismissal, or attempts to undermine what has been said. But even then, something has changed. Once spoken clearly without anger, the truth has a way of lingering. It remains in the space, quiet but present, no longer tangled in emotion, no longer easy to dismiss as mere reaction. And for you, there is a different kind of strength in speaking this way. It is not about winning an argument or proving a point. It is about remaining aligned with what you know to be real without allowing someone else's behavior to pull you away from that center. It is the ability to express without losing yourself in the process. There is also a certain peace that comes with it. When you no longer feel the need to raise your voice to be heard, when you trust that your words can stand without force, you begin to move differently. You are not pulled into the same cycles, not drawn into the same patterns of escalation. You speak, and then you let the truth be what it is. And in that space, something becomes clear. What they try to hide does not need to be chased or exposed through confrontation. It reveals itself in the presence of steady truth, not all at once, not always dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways. Because in the end, truth does not need anger to have power. It only needs to be spoken clearly and without fear. There is a certain sensitivity they have, though it does not appear as softness or empathy. It reveals itself in the way they watch for reactions, in how quickly they notice a shift in your tone, a crack in your composure, a moment where your emotions rise to the surface. They may not respond to your feelings with care, but they are keenly aware of them, because to them, those emotions are not signals to understand you. They are openings to influence you. Pain, for instance, has a way of drawing attention. When you are hurt, your words carry more weight, your reactions become less guarded, and in those moments, you may reveal more than you intended. They learn from this. They observe what affects you, what unsettles you, what makes you question yourself. And once they know, those very points can be revisited, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, not to resolve anything, but to keep the dynamic in their favor. Guilt is another powerful thread they may pull. It can be introduced quietly, woven into conversations in ways that make you feel responsible for things that were never truly yours to carry. You may find yourself apologizing more than you should, explaining more than is necessary, trying to restore a balance that was never actually broken by you. And while you are busy trying to make things right, they remain in a position where they do not have to look too closely at themselves. Fear, too, has its place in this pattern, not always as something obvious or spoken, but as an undercurrent. The fear of conflict, the fear of losing connection, the fear of being misunderstood. These are not weaknesses in you. They are human responses. But in the wrong hands, they can be used to keep you in a space where you hesitate, where you second guess, where you stay engaged even when something within you is asking for distance. What becomes important then is not the absence of these emotions, but your awareness of them. You are not expected to feel nothing. You are not meant to become untouched by pain or immune to guilt or fear. But there is a difference between feeling an emotion and being led by it. When you begin to notice how certain reactions are being drawn out of you, when you pause long enough to understand what is happening beneath the surface, you create a space between the feeling and the response. And in that space, you have a choice. You can choose not to react immediately. You can choose not to explain when explanation is not truly needed. You can choose not to carry guilt that does not belong to you. These choices may feel small in the moment, but over time, they change the entire rhythm of the interaction. Because what once felt like an automatic response becomes a deliberate decision. They may continue to test those emotional edges, to see if the old patterns still exist, if the same reactions can still be reached. But when they are met with something different, not indifference, but steadiness, the effect begins to change. The emotional charge they once relied on is no longer as accessible. The same triggers no longer produce the same outcome. And this is where their weakness quietly reveals itself. Not in their words, not in their presence, but in their dependence on what they can draw out of you. When that access becomes limited, when your emotions are no longer easily turned into tools, the dynamic begins to shift. You are still human. You still feel. But you are no longer being guided by those feelings in ways that leave you vulnerable to manipulation. Instead, you hold them with awareness, with care, with intention. And in doing so, you take back something essential, not by force, but by understanding. There is a quiet shift that happens when you no longer look to them for approval, and it is not always visible at first. It does not arrive with noise or announcement. It begins within you, in the small moments where you choose your own judgment over their opinion, where you pause before seeking their validation, where you start to trust what you feel without needing it to be confirmed. And in those moments, something subtle but powerful begins to change. You see, their influence has never been built on strength alone. It has been built on access to your need for reassurance, your desire to be seen, your hope to be accepted. These are deeply human needs, nothing to be ashamed of. But when those needs are placed in the hands of someone who uses them for control rather than care, they become the very channels through which power is taken from you. They learn what matters to you. They learn when you seek their approval, when you wait for their reaction, when your sense of self begins to bend in response to their words. And in that learning, a pattern forms. Approval is given, then withheld. Validation is offered, then questioned. You are lifted, then left uncertain, not always in obvious ways, but enough to keep you reaching, enough to keep you engaged in a cycle where their opinion begins to carry more weight than your own. But the moment you begin to step out of that cycle, even slightly, the dynamic starts to lose its hold. When you make a decision without looking to them first, when you hold your ground without needing their agreement, when you feel something and allow it to be valid simply because it is yours, you begin to close the space they once occupied. This is not about rejecting others or refusing all feedback. It is about reclaiming the center of your own understanding. It is about recognizing that your worth does not increase with their praise, nor does it diminish with their disapproval. And once that recognition takes root, their ability to influence how you see yourself begins to weaken. They may notice this shift, even if they do not name it. There may be moments where they attempt to draw you back into the old pattern, offering approval in ways that feel familiar, or withdrawing it in ways that once would have unsettled you. But when your sense of self is no longer anchored to their response, those actions begin to lose their effect. What once felt significant begins to feel distant, almost irrelevant. And in that distance, something opens up. You begin to move more freely, to think more clearly, to act without the constant weight of being evaluated. Your choices become your own again, not shaped by the anticipation of how they will be received, but guided by what feels right and true to you. This is where their power fades, not because they have changed, but because the foundation it rested on is no longer there. Without your need for their approval, there's nothing for them to leverage, nothing to withhold, nothing to control in the same way. And what remains is something far more stable, a sense of self that does not rise and fall with someone else's opinion, a quiet confidence that does not need to be granted from the outside. It grows from within, steady and self-sustaining. When you reach that place, you are no longer standing in their shadow, waiting to be seen. You are standing in your own light, whether they acknowledge it or not. And in that light, their influence becomes smaller, not through resistance, but through your refusal to depend on it any longer.